for coming to the conference. Thanks especially for showing up so early in the morning. And I also wanted to start by thanking David Goodkin for spearheading this all and for asking Armin and me to coordinate. It's been a real pleasure. It's great to see him coming over today. David's also our first speaker, so I'll start by introducing him. We have Untitled. So David is currently on faculty at the Peabody Institute and was until recently, or possibly sort of now, a fellow in the Columbia Society of Fellows. He's published on late 20th century opera, especially recently on Robert Ashley's television operas, among other things. His book project is called Meanwhile, Let's Go Back in Time, New York Avant-garde Opera and Historical Imagination, 1986 to 1989. Today he's talking about Robert Wilson.
Thanks very much, yeah, and thank you all for coming, and again, thanks for coming early in the morning. Armin and I thought we would take the hit and give the early presentations. I guess I should say one thing, given the title of our conference, which is Experiments in Opera Today. Obviously, I'm talking about a piece that's actually older than I am, so it's not necessarily today, and maybe we ought to qualify today a little bit. In fact, I think our scholarly presentations today are sort of bookended by older works. I'm not quite sure what to say, but other than that just kind of happened. We did mean today, and then we realized that it's hard to only talk about today, at least I think. But I am very happy that we'll also have, living composers and artists who will be presenting, especially tomorrow. Oh, one more thing to add, because it wasn't on the website. Our film screening tonight of Montia Diawara's documentary about the Somalian opera. Montia Diawara will join us and we'll be in conversation with Saskia Sassen and Richard Sennett, fellow sociologists. So that just happened at the last minute.
Great.
Okay, thanks very much. American avant-garde theater artist Robert Wilson has never been forthcoming about the meaning of his surreal, notably elusive works. When asked about his nearly silent, extremely long plays from the late 1960s, he would simply say he did not know what they meant. And when discussing his 1976 opera, Einstein on the Beach, developed in collaboration with Philip Glass, he tended to speak of geometric forms rather than comment on the ostensible subject matter. So why is Albert Einstein playing violin while a chorus is chanting a succession of numbers and solfege syllables? He's not going to tell you. There is nothing totally exceptional in this. Many artists refuse to explain what their work is about. But with Wilson, the resistance to signification was something like a fundamental premise of his art. And indeed, his most astute early commentators, in particular Richard Foreman, celebrated the way his work seemed to repel meaning. And so it was perhaps surprising when, in the early 1980s, Wilson supplied his new project, titled The Civil Wars, with a strong, even rather hackneyed message. The Civil Wars was meant to, quote, present an account of human struggle and survival through the ages, concluding in a great affirmation of the oneness of humanity and the possibility of universal accord, unquote. Now there's a plausible explanation for Wilson's departure from his typical reticence. This was marketing. Billed as an international opera, The Civil Wars was to be a massive collaborative endeavor involving hundreds of artists, writers, and musicians from around the world. Following its development in segments in Tokyo, Cologne, Rome, Marseille, Rotterdam, and Minneapolis, the sections were to be assembled as a 12-hour spectacle that would headline the Arts Festival of the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Even after successfully pitching the project to the Olympic Organizing Committee, Wilson had to sell the idea to corporate and private donors in order to raise half of the $2 to $3 million required for its production. So, I mean, that's basically, as far as I know, unprecedented sum of money in the world of experimental theater, at least. So you see here some of the production, or some of the kind of international committee that was supposed to help convince fundraisers to get on board.
Would you mind dimming the lights with it?
Oh, sure. There are lights on there. Thanks, Heather. So it's hard to raise $1.5 million while saying you don't know what the work is about. So, for instance, you could give it an Olympics-worthy message, such as bringing together an impressive press intersection of major international performing artists on the same stage. The work will represent the Olympics, at the Olympics, an expression of the worldwide artistic and entertainment community, much as the games themselves represent the oneness of humanity through the athletic events. So you can say something like that, for example. There is no doubt that marketing was part of what was going on, but as I will argue, this was scarcely the whole picture, and the idea that Wilson imputed themes to the work in complete bad faith just to get it produced is unconvincing. I mean, among other things, he wanted to make this big international work in the first place, so he had some idea of this topic. The marketing angle might, however, draw our attention to a key bit of historical context, namely that the Civil Wars was being developed during the first wave of an emergent discourse about globalization that corresponded to major transformations in world markets beginning in the 1970s, and which we today roughly call the advent of neoliberalism. And indeed, if we turn to the archives of the Civil Wars Project, which are actually housed here at Columbia in the Rare Books Library, we find a vast paper trail of fundraising efforts that serve the kind of snapshot of international money and finance in the early 1980s. The Los Angeles Games themselves were the first games to be entirely funded by private interests, with no subsidies from governments. They've gone down in athletic history as the, quote, neoliberal games. The Civil Wars also resonated with a broader set of discourses on globalization, or maybe we should say globality, that were appearing mostly since World War II, and which described the advent of a new era of planetary interconnectedness traversing all domains of life. So as just one example, in 1949, Karl Jaspers, the philosopher, called World War II the event that inaugurated a new era of, quote, world history as one single history of the whole world. Something of these global sentiments are perhaps evident in a letter that artist and transhumanist pioneer Natasha Vita-Moore wrote to Wilson while he was working on the Civil Wars. So she writes, "The concept of the Olympics and the potpourri of ethnic classes, styles, stories, our own mythic evolution, our ability to group together and utilize our talents as global people is a marvelous commitment, and your ability to pluck from these sources regardless of time and locale. You set an example which I followed to allow myself the freedom to explore and tempt the illustration of Earth as an architectural format on and with which to display a performance piece." Quite a letter. All of which brings me to the main question I want to explore today. What kinds of relationships can we posit between the Civil War's ostensible theme, that is, humanity's struggle toward universal brotherhood and peace, and the historical and socio-economic context of its production? Now, I retain the gendered noun brotherhood for a reason, for this is really to ask what an image of universal history rooted in the late 18th and 19th centuries meant in the early 1980s, during which time the world was crossing the threshold of a new era of globalization. In this talk, I want to show that the problem of meaning in the Civil Wars is not incidental to any of this, but rather constitutes a useful perspective on an enormous topic that I'm hardly equipped to treat in general. And I should say that there's a third term that I'll eventually add to my discussion that kind of mediates between universal history and globality, and that's the idea of post-history. But I must add one last vital piece of information, which significantly complicates any discussion of the Civil Wars. It never quite happened. The parts were never assembled in a single performance, nor were they even all completed. Wilson and his team never managed to raise the money required, and only 2 months before it was to be premiered in Los Angeles, the head of the Olympics Arts Festival announced the work's cancellation. Parts of the work were produced in Rome, Rotterdam, Cologne, and Minneapolis, but other parts, specifically Tokyo and Marseille, were only workshopped. So in this talk, I'm left to sift through the fragments that remain of the Civil Wars. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of background on Wilson, which many of you might know, but nevertheless. The experimental performance that Wilson encountered, the experimental performance scene that Wilson encountered upon moving to New York in 1963 was characterized by radical subversions of theatrical norms, including exploding the conventional boundaries between audience and stage event, and generally interrogating divisions between art and life, so to speak. And he's following, of course, in the wake of John Cage, also Alan Capra's Happenings, the Living Theater, and other groups. Wilson has often explained his own theater as a reaction against the these sometimes anarchic spectacles, and placed particular emphasis on his reinstatement of the proscenium arch of classical theater. But far from repudiating the avant-garde's assault on autonomous art, Wilson recalls that he was interested in observing, quote, life as it is, before he gave any thought to a career in theater. So he says, I found, quote, the mundane acts of someone baking bread, or making a salad, or simply sipping tea more interesting than extraordinary feats. And to that end, to make a kind of theater that involves these everyday activities, he assembled around him this group of actors or non-actors, not mostly trained actors, the School of Birds, beginning in '68, I think, and continuing through the mid-'70s. But as well as these sort of everyday quotidian activities that were worked into his theater pieces, there were always also these dreamlike aspects, grotesquerie, lots of animals, nightmarish scenarios. And that particularly comes to the fore in this piece, Calm Mountain. The coexistence of the real and the surreal, the everyday and the fantastical, appears most dramatically in Calm Mountain, a piece that in its scale and global theme could be regarded as a precursor to the Civil Wars. Commissioned by Iran's Shiraz Arts Festival and sponsored by the Empress Farah, the wife of the Shah, Calm Mountain took place over 7 continuous days and nights on Haftan Mountain. Along with imagery, 7 nights continuous, that's amazing. Along with imagery depicting the change of seasons and the passage of world civilization, is the real-time, changing light of the passing days and nights, the mountain itself, and the mundane actions of the School of Birds as they eat and sleep and so on. But not only the School of Birds, the work ultimately involved over 700 people from across the world. Wilson would later proclaim the work's greatest novelty, its assemblage of many kinds of people in an almost literalized Tower of Babel. So he writes, walking up the scaffolding structure, one could sit and converse with a wide range of people, artists, housewives, teachers, scholars, shepherds. People were talking about anything and everything, politics, art, how to make a pizza, and how to build a house. We were like a large family evolving. Thus Wilson sought a grand rapprochement between art and life that would foreground not only the creation of beautiful images, but the gathering together of real people. Not only the depiction of multicultural coexistence, but its microcosmic actualization. And yet it must be said that this convergence of art and life was of a rather qualified kind. Seemingly absent from Wilson's concerns were some key facets of real life. Neither Wilson nor his School of Birds expressed any wariness about participating in an arts festival sponsored by the autocratic leader of the state that regularly tortured dissidents. A client state of the United States, by the way. One of the Birds recalled later on, quote, we were all so politically naive, it didn't occur to us that there may have been some troubles going on in Iran. You couldn't talk to the Birds about politics that didn't exist, we were making art. So I'll return to this art-life convergence that excludes so much of reality at the end of my talk. But now I'm going to get back to the Civil Wars, and specifically its status as opera. It's a word that Wilson began to use at least by the early 70s, after I think some critics suggested it. And he talks about Calm Mountain, at least in retrospect, as opera. He says, looking at the original definition of the word opera in Latin, one finds that opus means a work. And this is how I would describe Calm Mountain. All of the arts were present. As some of you surely noticed, his definition of opera rather recalls Wagner's famous concept, which was supposed to supplant opera, namely Gesamtkunstwerk. But I want to look or consider that Civil Wars is, in a sense, Wilson's first opera that also includes something that we would call more or less traditional opera. It actually involves opera singers, orchestras, and so on, which an early work like Einstein, for example, doesn't. That distinguishes it, and I'll talk about that later. But now I just want to very briefly just tell you a little more about the Civil Wars, who is or was to be involved, or going to be a handful of main composers. So Philip Glass is one, the Japanese composer Joe Kondo is another, Gavin Bryars is the third major composer to be involved, and there are some other kinds of ancillary ones. Jesse Norman was supposed to sing in that didn't end up happening. David Byrne, from the Talking Heads, was involved. There are also many theater artists, including Tadashi Suzuki, who's a great experimental artist in Japan. And that's only kind of the beginning of it. Heiner Müller, the East German playwright, as well, was to be involved. And also, I want to mention both of these people because it's a kind of list that's heavy on men, but there are some women as well. Ligeti was carrying out historical research, which I'll talk about as a kind of dramaturg, and Escalator, who's a Lebanese-French writer and artist, was involved in one of the sections that only got workshopped. I'll say more about that later, but let's get into the Civil Wars now. The Civil Wars was supposed to deal with nothing less than the whole of human history. The work is indeed populated by a vast array of figures: Abraham Lincoln, Frederick the Great, Harriet Tubman, Joan of Arc, many others. We also find numerous characters pulled from myth, fairy tales, and literature. So we have Hercules, Don Quixote, Captain Nemo, Scarlett O'Hara, the list goes on. Here's a more or less typical scene. So this is like from the libretto. There's a man in the tree, there's a lion, there's Goethe, there's Henry V, there's an opera singer, there's Voltaire, Frederick the Great, a tin soldier, drummer boy, Duke of Burgundy. Also, in addition to this, there are historical texts and music which are drawn from all kinds of sources, from Shakespeare, Voltaire, 14th century Japanese poetry, letters from Mary Curie, all of which is in the original language, so there's at least 8 different languages in the production. There's music taken from Schubert's Erlking, Thomas Tallis, Japanese Gagaku. It's all just kind of spliced together. It's a kind of monumental portrait of world culture. But within that portrait, there actually is a preponderance of figures constellating around the mid-19th century. And that's not entirely incidental. Wilson said the work was conceived after he received a book of Matthew Brady's famous photographs of the American Civil War. That conflict then became the template for a vision of all history as a series of civil wars on all different scales, fathers versus sons, nations, entire continents. Thus, the incredible variety of historical fragments was subsumed under the unifying theme of conflict and put in the service of a story, having passed through the civil wars, large and small, that have defined history. Humankind eventually achieves worldwide peace. I take this as a kind of fable version of Kant's 1784 essay, Idea for a Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Perspective, in which awesomeness, as it's at least translated sometimes, is meant to function as a catalyst for humanity's development. For Kant, the endless wars that drive this process forward should eventually lead to an international government that will put an end to war itself. But it is admittedly hard to imagine Wilson the dreamer going in for an Enlightenment narrative of progressing rationality. And I think that this incongruousness alerts us to a fundamental problem in the Civil War's ostensible story, which is that of narrative or narrative representation as such. So there's this ostensible story, but what actually happens? Universal history was premised on the idea that history can be adequately represented as a narrative, even then in some broader sense history was a metaphysical narrative. And yet the Civil Wars seem to be anything but narrative. Der Spiegel tersely commented, "Nobody knows the entire plot, as there isn't one." Wilson referred to the work as a huge collage. He also called it, quote, "a fantastic history of the human race which can be taken apart arbitrarily and always put together differently like a giant hamburger." I don't know why hamburger was a metaphor. It's not the most obvious one. Indeed, the Civil Wars forsakes the linearity of stories. Its succession of scenes does not depict any progression of historical ages. Even within single scenes, figures, text, and sounds from divergent periods are thrown together. So, for example, you might see a scene like this as the storyboards. Japan, 1877, there's samurais, then there are animals. The League of Princes Henry IV, Spain in 1936, the ruined University of Madrid, Dresden in 1756, more ninjas, aristocrats, etc. So, perhaps it is not surprising that a number of critics wrote off the work's story about humankind's journey from war to peace as a pretense. These same critics often call the Civil Wars emblematic of a, quote, post-historical aesthetic. And indeed, the opera's eclectic assemblage of historical fragments certainly resonates with an idea, pervasive in the 1970s and 80s, that history had been transformed into but a virtual stockpile of images, quotations and references, which, free from the narratives that once gave them meaning, could now be sifted and combined according to whim. However, I want to suggest we move beyond the opera's self-evident post-histoire look, as one critic put it, to grasp its deeper entanglement with the notion of post-history that was more ambiguous than these commentators allowed. So my point's not that the critics were wrong to call it post-historical, but that they actually didn't know how right they were because they weren't taking the concept seriously enough or thinking about the history of post-history. So to do this, we have to look at what post-historical is actually meant, and here I'm going to put it very sort of simply because that's a huge topic. The flourishing of post-historical diagnoses that emerged in the wake of World War II were generally pessimistic. The end of history designated the end of a dynamic, meaningful epoch of human development, and the beginning of a new era of worldwide stasis under the crystallizations of technological society. But the idea of the post-historical had long contained a utopian impulse no less central. Hegel's end of history meant the purposive conclusion of history in the achievement of a universal state and perpetual peace. So underpinning this kind of contrast between the utopian versus the pessimistic signification of post-history is a fundamental tension. And that tension is namely that the end of history is both the fulfillment and the disappearance of something like historical meaning. It's both the completion and the dissolution of a historical narrative. And I want to suggest that this is the central tension that the Civil Wars plays on. And I'm going to look at this from a couple different angles, and it brings me back to the whole matter of narrative and representation in the work. So I said that the work wasn't particularly narrative in an obvious sense, but that's actually only partially true. There is one rather narrative element that runs through it, and it comes in these scenes that are called knee plays. There are these interpolations that come between all of the kinds of different episodes. And across these knee plays, they're performed with Japanese bunraku puppets. So these puppets, large puppets held up by sticks, and they're telling a kind of simple story of a sort of a tree that's turned into a tree into a boat that's turned into a book, and then back into a tree. And eventually, at least in some versions of it, there's also a book that's still somehow levitating on top of the tree. And although it's hard to say just what it is, it seems to be in some way some kind of allegory of humankind's journey or some sort of journey. And with a little imagination, I want to suggest at least we might perceive in the conceit of the world as book, some glimmer of Hegel's end of history, as one commentator put it, the coming of science in form of a book and the appearance of absolute knowledge in the world. The kind of cyclic nature of this story also, I would say, shows the ways in which a kind of sacred notion of history underpins secular universal history. But the fable that Wilson tells in this kind of narrative also picks up bits of subject matter from the opera. So, for example, Admiral Perry in Japan in the mid-19th century enter into it. And indeed, at some points, the knee plays even threaten to turn back into the vast historical collage that the rest of the work deals with. So here's another scene. All of a sudden, for some reason, there's Goethe lying on the table in the midst of this kind of fable. So there's a sense in which the collage is not just happening in the topics, it's actually in the presentation. So you have these bunraku puppets delivering this fable, but then there's also the element of music and sound behind it. Specifically, it's the music excuse me, of David Byrne, played by the Dirty Dozen brass band in a kind of New Orleans brass band style. So while these things are going on, the brass band is playing David Byrne's composition, and in this track I'll play you, Byrne is reciting a kind of litany of utopian and dystopian tropes, and also rather odder ideas.
In the future, there will be starving people everywhere. In the future, people will live in space. In the future, no one will be able to afford TV. In the future, the helpless will be killed. In the future, everyone will have their own style, way up close. In the future, we will make love for anything, anytime, anywhere. In the future, there will be so much going on, no one will be able to keep track of it.
Okay, so the idea that I guess I'm trying to get at here is that there is this tension in the idea of the end of history between narrative and its dissolution between plot and collage on some level, and that this is in a way what the piece is working through. And I want to also move to language. This trope of the Book of the World raises the idea of language specifically. Now Wilson's ambivalence about language if not his outright hostility toward it, is well known. He was said to always gravitate toward the mute power of images above all else. And indeed, as I mentioned, Matthew Brady's photographs were supposed to have been the principal inspiration behind the Civil Wars. But that's the story, and it's not, seemingly to me at least, entirely accurate. In fact, the first version of the Civil Wars didn't contain any references to Brady's photographs or to any visual content, because it was actually conceived before the whole project was planned out as a radio play in 1979. And the text of the radio play consists of streams of simple statements, odd exclamations, banal questions. It's a kind of endless chattering, too disjunct to attain much significance, yet still tied in some way to the particularity of meaning, unlike a number of Wilson's earlier experiments with nonsense sounds, so language still means kind of something. So we see stuff like this. This is switch, chicken salad, pickle, pig killer, J, ground speed. What it about? Why the recorder? There's like 300 pages of this. And actually, among those 300 pages or so, there are some other kinds of language. Specifically, if you look at the bottom, there are historical or literary texts that are spliced in. This is from Henry V, I think. Had nothing new but meditate on blood. So there is, again, this kind of collage is intruding into it from world history. And actually, the Civil Wars does figure in. The first historical text that I could find that he used is this line, "It must have been a terrible war." It's actually a line from a letter describing Robert E. Lee returning home from the Civil War. It's this incredibly poignant letter about Lee on a horse in the rain going home. And it must have been a terrible war. It becomes the kind of leitmotif of the entire opera. It occurs throughout. And I would suggest that it's almost an image of history from the vantage point beyond history. History must have been a terrible war. Running alongside all the other kinds of texts or snippets of the original dialogue, this is how it makes its way into the eventual sort of form of the Civil Wars. So he does take this dialogue and just kind of is layered on top. And there's this pervasive tension between the vast intertextual museum of world culture and Wilson's weird, mindless chattering. An analogous tension might be located in the conception of post-history that has had perhaps the greatest influence on 20th century thinkers. That's the conception of post-history as Alexander Kojève delivered to France in his lectures in the 1930s. So it's Kojève interpreting Hegel, but in a sense really reinterpreting Hegel and very pivotally inflecting how post-history was received in the 20th century by Leo Strauss and Fukuyama, among many others. Kojève wrote that it is only at the end of history that, quote, the totality of history can thus be understood, unquote, that the welter of events that have constituted world history become philosophically and discursively comprehended. And yet, as he added in a famous footnote, in the end of history, or during it, in discursive understanding, and with it, historical man, as something to be distinguished from animals and nature, ultimately disappears. Just as humans will persist in post-history only in an external sense, as the animal called Homo sapien, their language will be only the shell of its prior richness, consisting of, quote, in his words, conditioned reflexes to vocal signals or sign language, like what is supposed to be the language of bees. I see the Civil Wars as an exercise in just this post-historical paradox, as the dramatization of a comprehension simultaneously achieved and liquidated, as an attempt to recapitulate the history of the world from a point beyond the horizon of language's ability to signify much of anything. And in these oppositions that I've been making, I wanted to show that there's no flat-out dissolution of meaning. It's not all collage, it's not all nonsense. There's always the strong kernel of meaning and the kernel of narrative, and specifically a kind of 19th century utopian narrative. And I want to suggest that in some sense this is holding on to a shred of the narrative sense of history, of universal history, which was always actually a part of the idea of post-history. And in a broader sense, this has to do with the way in which the 19th century is front and center, kind of embedded in the work. What strikes me especially is that there is a way in which the 19th century, the era of the great narratives of history, forms a kind of core. There is a sense in which the entirety of the Civil Wars is constructed under the sign of the 19th century. From the historical events that take center stage, to the fantastical imagery from Jules Verne novels, to the very form, opera. And again, it's not just opera in the sense that Wilson meant for his earlier pieces. It's something like, real opera or traditional opera, specifically in the scenes composed by Glass. And I'd say that it's no coincidence that in the work's kind of paradisiacal, anyway, its paradise conclusion, Hercules returns to Earth, and we're hearing strains of a kind of a neo-Verdian opera. So this is music by Glass. Sorry about that. Let me play this. Okay, so inside the Rome Opera House in 1982, where this was premiered, something like Paradise. Outside the Rome Opera House in 1982, the electricians were on strike, causing a major problem to producing this thing, part of a deep labor unrest in Italy that rocked the country in the 70s and 80s. And so that brings me to returning basically to my question, what does the Civil Wars have to do with developments in the real world, outside of its imagination? The Civil Wars could be regarded as a version of a particular modernist fantasy, that of the totality of the world redoubled in a book. It's a fantasy you see in Borges and Gertrude Stein, and in Mallarmé before them. Mallarmé said that the world exists in order to end up in a book. Wilson went one step further toward this modernist ideal as he gestured toward representational totality while pushing at the limits of representation, by rendering sounds, images, and words disjunct, at times nearly opaque units of sensory experience. The texts of history were aestheticized and pushed toward abstraction. According to this interpretation, then, the Civil Wars was to be a kind of multimedia book of the world that somehow hovers separate from the world. Recalled, however, the last image in the knee plays. The world ends up in a book, but then grows back out of it. And indeed, the Civil Wars was supposed to be anything but a private affair separated from the world. Wilson compared the opera to a rock concert for the masses. A German newspaper reported that Wilson wanted the piece to appear on television so that it become a world, quote, a world-embracing event, common property for all mankind. Wilson even wanted the Civil Wars to appear in short segments on television in department stores, supermarkets, banks, airplanes, and buses. Far from being an autonomous work of art, the Civil Wars was meant to thoroughly interpenetrate the real world. And here I return to that letter from Natasha Vita-Moore, specifically where she talks about the illustration of the Earth as an architectural format. She seems to be writing about both Carl Mountain and maybe in some way the Civil Wars. And as Vita-Moore intimated, there is a sense that Wilson took the Earth itself as a medium, I'd say in both works. Now this is overt in the case of Carl Mountain. It's actually on the mountain, the Earth is the medium. But it's maybe even more fundamental in the Civil Wars, in the imagination of it happening all over the globe at the same time in different bits and pieces. And it's in this idea of the whole globe, or the world, as a medium that I detect a fairly novel conception of globality. This reading, in which the Civil Wars was to envelop the world, appears completely opposed to the idea of a separate artistic world contained in a book. But in fact, I think the two interpretations complement each other in some way. And to grasp how, we have to return to the whole matter of art and life and the proscenium stage with which I began. Earlier I mentioned that in Carl Mountain's synthesis of real life and art, a great deal of reality was excised, namely the entire socio-political situation. Rather than simply chalking this up to Wilson and his actors' naivety, although that was definitely a factor, I think we can locate deeper sources in the very idea of lifelike art that Wilson inherited from Cage and from the avant-garde. Although it is little recognized, the post-war attempts to fashion an art that was not cordoned off from life always involved some residual concept of art's autonomy. And this is too big of a claim to make entirely here, but what I mean by that is in the coin flipping and chance procedures of Cage, in the play of relation to life of Alan Capro, there was always some notion of something other than regular life, some separate system. And there was always a kind of mashup of artistic autonomy and worldly immanence in this idea of an art that's part of life. I want to say that something like this contradiction was concretized in Wilson's desire to reinstate the proscenium arch while presenting an art that was like life. It is as if we were directly witnessing the framing and purifying of real life, its transformation into something like play. In Calm Mountain, even in the absence of a literal proscenium arch stage, the effect obtains. We have a work of art whose peculiar greatness is a real gathering of real people doing all kinds of things together, depends on a purification, on our forgetting under what real-world conditions the event could occur in the first place. With the Civil Wars, the situation was slightly different. The real conditions of its production were not so much excluded as transformed into the elements of the artwork. A letter from Wilson's team seeking funds from prospective donors reports that efforts to produce the work have, quote, created a vast international network of collaboration unparalleled in theater history, unquote, that included foundations, institutions, government agencies, and multinational corporations. In all of the publicity and media coverage, the distinct implication was that these complex networks were a part of the work itself, and indeed a part of its meaning. The mobilization of people, institutions, and money were all to be figured as elements of a total work of art that, taking the whole Earth as its stage, would attest to a new kind of global existence. Anyway, that's what I believe Wilson was going for in this. That he's not just representing a utopian narrative, but again actually instantiating it by mobilizing all of these forces. And somehow by doing this, it was to purify all of these forces of the elements of exploitation that we could see latent in them. And now I want to get towards my conclusion. Here we might consider some ironies in the history of the Civil Wars. If the opera's meaning was to have somehow been coterminous with conditions of its global production, it ultimately achieved this in the least desirable way. For the work's meaning became inseparable from a story about its financial ruination. Indeed, the most durable testament to the Civil Wars was a documentary chronicling Wilson's manic efforts to raise money for the production. So basically, like half of this really great documentary, Wilson's on the phone trying to get donors and companies to give him money. In the end, this was a global story, not one about universal brotherhood, but about the vicissitudes of international finance and patronage. More specifically, in the narrative that prevails in avant-garde theater lore, the Civil Wars was a victim of the privatizing juggernaut of neoliberalism unleashed on the world over the course of the 1970s and 1980s and centered, above all, in the United States. And what I mean by this lore about it, you have articles like this in the left-wing French publication Libération, the Wilson Affair. That's basically how American commercialism and Philistinism did Wilson in and did the project in. And yet, the irony, it was precisely the emergent neoliberal agenda that the Civil Wars would have served had it made it to the Olympics. There's an article in a magazine called The Nation's Business that was titled "The Unstated Message of the 1984 Olympics. The Los Angeles Games will show U.S. private enterprise at work." One sociologist even said that the LA Games, slightly overstating the case, helped to legitimate a sweeping neoliberal political project in the United States with repercussions across the globe. There are images from the Civil War's attempts to gain funding that say things, everybody does this, but I'm not trying to call them out, but they say images from the Civil War as a credit for sponsorship may be used by a major corporate sponsor in whatever way it deems important. On an actual deeper level, though, even the very narrative of the Civil Wars, or its ostensible narrative, the utopian arch, is of course the narrative that the defenders, the proponents of globalization, issued themselves. Of course, Fukuyama primarily. So, despite all of this, I am not inclined to read Wilson's lofty statements about the Civil Wars as disingenuous or cynical. At least not any more so than the rhetoric of those who truly believed neoliberal globalization was part of the march toward planetary peace, and even in one notorious case toward the benign end of history. If in the end Wilson's attempt to transform the world into a total work of art collapsed into the world, if rather than achieving utopian globality, the Civil Wars was reduced to an episode in the history of globalization, how could it have been otherwise? Faith in the purifying power of art is as much a remnant of another age as stories about humankind's inexorable progress. But to end here would be self-satisfied. Neither art nor the dream of cosmopolitan universalism can simply be derided and dispatched. Through the ruins of the Civil Wars, we might catch a glimpse of an old utopian image as necessary to retain as it may be impossible to achieve. I'll close with the last lines of a telegram that Heiner Müller wrote to Wilson upon learning of the cancellation of the civil wars. When panthers walk between the counters of the World Bank and eagles in their soaring flight tear to pieces the flags that separate us, the theater of resurrection will have found its stage. A tree is best measured when it is down. Which is the subtitle, I should have said, of the work. A tree is best measured when it is down. It's a line from Carl Sandburg's biography of Abraham Lincoln. A tree is best measured when it's down. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. There's so many things to kind of pull out there, and I'm especially curious about, about this, I think what you could almost call it nostalgia, right, for kind of mid-19th world that the opera seems to embody in some ways, and particularly that moment of opera as a kind of, looking back to the classical past, this kind of humanist nodal point, really. But I think I'm going to pick a slightly different, simpler entry point, and that is this idea of the Civil Wars, or fragments of the Civil Wars playing in buses and all of these kind of sort of commercial sites as well. Does it matter in his imagination how people pay attention to these things, or is that really beside the point?
That's a really good question, and one that I would have to think about more. I mean, in a sense, maybe would also later perhaps defer to some people in the audience and also study Wilson's work. Doesn't matter how people pay attention to it. Obviously, if he's imagining that it's happening in supermarkets and buses, I mean, this is just according to one Der Spiegel article, but I assume that he said something to have written that. I think that he is happy for people to just sort of encounter it in one way or another. Now, the kind of experience, as far as if experience is what's at stake, that he seems to have been interested in the Civil Wars is one, and again this gets back to the kind of popular roots that he has in some way in mind. He talks about rock concerts as his kind of ideal. He wants to make a kind of opera that is somehow a mass spectacle, like a rock concert. I'm not actually sure, I know that he did like pop music and rock music. I'm not sure that he ever really went to rock concerts, so I should find out. So he mentions rock concerts, then he also mentions, and because I've not seen this, maybe someone can tell me about this huge, long film from the early 80s or late 70s about Napoleon that's 3 hours long with screened in outdoor theaters. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
He's the director? Or?
Yeah, 1929 film with
Oh, it was
restored and then
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So he was interested in these outdoor screenings that of this film, and that was his other kind of popular point of reference. And he wanted something that would kind of break down, I don't know, the kind of elite mode of theater going perception. So that's what I would say would experience with the perception of it.
They just seem like the most distracted spaces possible. It's just like a catalog of distracted spaces. But I'll open it up. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you so much for this paper. It's very fascinating. I just wanted to know a little bit more about the language, because you make such a big point about like language disintegrated. But all of the texts that you showed us were English. So was there any attempt to like make the language also more like disoriented by including other languages?
Yes, I'm sorry that I did only show English, but yes, so it actually, all of the texts that are used, occasionally something might be translated, but basically everything is in its original language. I have to count more carefully, but there's at least 8 languages happening in the piece, all interchanged, and including some languages that very few people will speak. I mean, there's bits of Latin, but there's also bits of Hopi Native American language. Part of the idea was the collaboration. Wilson wrote these texts, and Wilson, as far as I know, I should actually ask this too, I think he only knows English, or he always claims that he doesn't even know the languages that are being, worked on when his works are being done in other places. Or when he was working with Heiner Müller, he doesn't know German, but he says that's no problem to working with him. So he involved all these other writers, and he basically said, do what you want, or I don't know quite what he said, but in your own language. And he didn't really know, I guess some of it, in the production files, bits are translated for his own knowledge, but not to the audience, and the audience wasn't expected to know these languages. That was part of the experience. So comprehension of the languages does not seem to have been a primary concern.
Do you have any idea of the logistics of the rehearsals? Were they taking place in different locations around the world? Was it part of the rehearsal, or was he delegating the job to other guests, other artists, or the directors?
Well, let me answer the first part, then I have to ask you about the last part. So so the rehearsals were taking place all over the world, and in fact, I was a little unclear on this because it's such a big work, and I was trying to get through a lot and not just summarize what this work is, but the work was rehearsed and performed in the original locations around the world. The idea was that it would be performed locally, so to speak. So the Rome section would be done in Rome, the Tokyo section would be done in Tokyo, etc. And then those 6 different locations would all come together. They would bring all the theater companies and all the equipment and everything over to Los Angeles and assemble it all in 12 hours. But the discrete sections were rehearsed and performed in those places. And they were, and in a few places they were performed, and in a few places they were only rehearsed. There's actually, so there's performance footage that's all in the New York Public Library, most of the performances, and there's even some rehearsal footage there, all the parts that weren't performed, including in Tokyo. It's at an NHK studio, and it involves a lot of really major, interesting experimental Japanese actors doing this work. So there is some rehearsal footage of it. And was there another part at the end of your question that I...
Was he personally directing the rehearsals, or was he?
Yes, he was. He was there in all the rehearsals. Yeah, he would fly to these different places, and he was directing them. Yeah, he was collaborating with people, but he was definitely directing them as well.
Thank you very much. It's a great thing. But it brought mind another piece of fields, another opera of fields. And now, when you talked about this. The Civil Wars appears as a kind of recipe for that opera also. And that opera is White Raven, that happened in 1998 in Lisbon. So it happened during the Lisbon Expo, which can be compared to Olympic Games, like an artistic event. The subject of the Expo was Rhodes waters. And then he enlaced the subject of the opera, the Portuguese discoveries. So also collage libretto, also various languages. Well, it was all packed more in format of the opera, but in a way it echoes a lot this piece. So it would be interesting to see these trails later.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have to admit that I've seen the name, but I don't know anything about it. Thank you. That sounds very relevant.
Yeah.
As you laid out, obviously. Yeah, thank you. I'll check that out.
Yeah, well, a couple comments and then a question. Early on, you mentioned Einstein and playing violin and what that means. Well, in fact, Einstein performed this very called design experiment, which were thought experiments on the piano. So it would have been. So that's a kind of arcane factor on this. I think actually developed special, well, general and special because we both all playing piano. So somehow his thinking was energized by music.
Yeah, I mean, and he also really did play the violin. So yes, so actually, yeah. Thank you. You're right. In some way, a lot of, I guess, I know I'll let you get back to the rest of your question too. But in some way, a lot of it's the reception of Einstein on the beach is always like, what does it mean? It's like it's just these images. It's impossible to interpret. And I actually agree, and maybe I overstated the case that there are many ways to interpret it. In fact, I recently read an excellent undergraduate paper that gave a very coherent interpretation of Einstein on the beach. So I agree that there's Einstein played the violin. There are elements of contemporary history, including Patty Hearst in the opera. There are things you can latch on to. So maybe in a way I was talking as much about what Wilson said about it and what his critics, or well-wishing critics said about it too.
Yeah, the relationship with Einstein is developed more fully in a book by Stefan Alexander called Jazz. The next one really has to do with the background of the kind of the cultural milieu of Zeitgeist at the time. So you have this whole trajectory of linear histories throughout the 20th century, world around sort of civilization, Toynbee, and probably most importantly is Ken Clark's TV series about civilization, which came in the early 60s, which I think in a sense almost Wilson is mimicking. Maybe not consciously, Wilbur did mention in reference to it. That's certainly a prominent event, cultural event at the time, right? So, in a sense, you also can be seen as mimicking something like that. And I think that gets to the point that I didn't hear you mention, which is that there's kind of a high culture, elite, popular culture thing where Wilson is consciously erasing high culture, right? In its democratization of access across multimedia. So I think there's sort of that thing going on too.
Thank you. That's a great point, and I didn't think about the Civilization TV series, but yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and then finally, there's the whole notion of the avant-garde and 70s sort of art, theater, music. You mentioned Richard Foreman. You could echo in the tour, or the Worcester group. I mean, there's so many different things happening in the 70s in downtown New York City that Wilson was fully informed about, and they did all this on no money.
Yep.
Right? And then in the 80s, with sort of the gallery scene where boom, money and mammon was formally introduced, and then suddenly artists who were broke and probably broke aspired to making lots of money. So guys like Basquiat, who were suddenly millionaires, right? And so the whole thing changed. It became very neoliberal, very libertarian, and so it essentially erased the avant-garde. And so I think Wilson's aspirations to the Olympics is a statement of that erasure of the avant-garde.
Yeah, I agree. And in a sense, that's part of the larger trajectory that I'm interested in the bigger project, the book that I'm tracing. In a sense, it's like what happens to the 60s avant-garde, so to speak, through the 70s and into the 80s. And Wilson's interesting there, I should say, too, because already in 1972, it's partially because he got such huge reception in France in particular, and was getting all the attention of Susan Sontag and Louis Aragon and so on, that he somehow was able to actually do these monumental productions even before the 80s. He was doing stuff that his kind of 60s experimental theater brethren weren't really getting the opportunities to do for a long time, if ever. So he was, I see him as like on the early cusp of
He's like the avant-garde theater.
Yeah.
Just one more question, then maybe we should move on.
Yeah, I was wondering, I missed others' comments, you might address this, but so what's the trajectory of knee plays, Einstein to this, to like what did, and that's obviously Wilson, I guess, more than Glass in this case. And I'm also wondering similarly, so Glass, I guess, becomes like the index for opera, which is, I mean, obviously Einstein's called an opera, but this is like operatic writing. And so where does this fit into Glass's? Is this around the time of Satyagraha, and is this Glass's first real like warbly solo vocal opera thing? And like why does he become the opera?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so it's right after Satyagraha, I believe. So Satyagraha is that 79 or 80?
It's like 79, 80.
Yeah. Okay, so it's right after Satyagraha. So this is supposed to happen in 84, but they're developing it. He began writing the script in 79, and then they're not really getting to the music until about like 81, 82, and 83. So it's after Satyagraha, and that's one reason that Glass has already become a warbly opera guy. I should say also, though, Gavin Breyer's sections were also, in a sense, operatic, except they just never actually got performed, so it's hard to say exactly what they were, but Glass wasn't the only one, but yeah. Maybe we should move.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David. And I think these papers will speak to each other quite a bit, so I'm sure if there are kind of really big issues, we'll come back to them. So next speaker is Armin Schwartz, who's a lecturer in the 20th century in contemporary music at King's College London. He's also the executive editor of Opera Quarterly and the author of Puccini's Soundscapes, Realism and Modernity in Italian Opera, and also the co-editor of Puccini and His World. His talk is called Opera and Objecthood from Einstein to Klinghoffer. Let's begin.
Thank you. As others said, this will pick up on a lot of the things David has been talking about in a slightly different context. So as I understand it, one of the central provocations of this conference is its attempt to think experimentalism, a practice that valorizes the ephemeral, the contingent, the networked, and the local, alongside a genre that, especially by the later 20th century, would have seemed predicated on its opposite, the massive, the ossified, the hierarchical, canonical. This tension or contradiction is surely inherent to any experimental opera worthy of the name. Nonetheless, it would be hard to imagine a work that inhabits the paradox more thoroughly than Robert Wilson and Philip Glass's 1976 Einstein on the Beach. On the one hand, Einstein remains, after more than 40 years, an unassimilably strange, collectively authored document of a specific moment in the downtown avant-garde. On the other, it is in every sense a worthy heir to the mantle of Aida, a virtuosic multimedia spectacle in love with the machinery of its own extravagance, a largely fixed text that has withstood tours and multiple revivals. Scholarship on Einstein, like scholarship on Wilson's work more generally, has unsurprisingly emphasized its anarchic qualities. Today, though, I want to explore Einstein's place in the museum. I'm interested in what it means for a group of experimental New York artists to turn to opera at a moment and in a city where the art form would have seemed unusually monumental and comatose. 10 years after the disastrous premiere of Samuel Barber's Neo-Verdian Antony and Cleopatra, and 15 years before the Met premiered another newly commissioned work. It's in this context that we might begin to make sense of a set of dramaturgical strategies for presenting opera not as a form of living communal theater, but rather as something utterly remote from its audience. Einstein's dramaturgy of distance, as I want to describe it, harkens back to an earlier modernist discourse of anti-theatricality, one that, as Martin Puchner has shown, extends from Gottfried Stein to Luigi Pirandello and Samuel Beckett, and from Walter Benjamin to Michael Fried. Indeed, and however counterintuitively, Fried's 1967 essay, Art and Objecthood, seems to present an unusually effective guide to the aesthetics of Einstein as a whole. In that essay, to recall a by now familiar argument, Fried claimed that minimalist sculpture risked denigrating into a dangerous condition he called theatricality, both by transgressing essential distinctions between media and by breaking down an even more important ontological distinction between a sort of condition of separation between a work of art and its beholder. From this perspective, you might expect a minimalist opera like Einstein would be doubly, if not triply, theatrical. And indeed, these are the terms through which Wilson has been celebrated by many of his most astute defenders. Julia Kristeva, for example, seemed to take on Fried directly in a speech awarding one of Wilson's performances the prize for sculpture at the 1993 Venice Biennale. The traditional categories, painting, sculpture, stagecraft, etc., no longer correspond to reality, she announced. Personally, I think this is due to the crisis in our psychic space and the borders that separate the object and the subject. In the same way that there's a breaking down of the boundaries between objects, there's an intrication of the roles of the artist and the spectator, erasing the borders between self and other. My claim, however, is that a theatrical intrication between artist and spectator, self and other, is precisely what Einstein struggles to avoid. To make a case for the opera's poetics of spectatorial refusal, then, I'd like to begin by cataloging some basic features of the work. First, in terms of autobiographical self-fashioning, both Glass and Wilson have repeatedly aligned themselves with the tradition of high modernist anti-theatricalism. Glass likes to cite the plays of Stein and Beckett as major influences, and I don't think it's an accident that these are precisely the texts that, for Puchner, were the vanguard of 20th century assaults on the status of the actor and the audience. Similarly, Wilson has claimed that his famously cool aesthetic emerged as an attempt to reject the intensely engaged and participatory practice of 1960s ensembles like the Living Theatre. In both cases, then, work that now seems predicated on a desire to blur, as Kristeva put it, the role of the artist and the spectator, erasing the borders between self and other, may actually have emerged from an impulse to maintain and reassert these very divisions. As Wilson himself states, I prefer a proscenium for many reasons. I like its form. I like the tension it sets up between 2 and 3 dimensions. I like the distance it creates between stage and audience. Second, we might note that Einstein doesn't just depend on, but actually emphasizes this distance between stage and audience, and in so doing, undermines the sort of communal experience on which most live theater depends. The opera begins before the audience enters the theater. It continues uninterrupted for 5 hours. Individual spectators can come and go as they please. When the piece was last done here at BAM, a common refrain was that it was so compelling that no one wanted to leave their seats. I think that to remain seated is in a real sense to misinterpret the work. It's a different experience if you arrive, leave, and return, only to realize that nothing has changed and that your own presence is irrelevant. Third, there's a suggestive affinity between this specific experience of irrelevance and a certain style of cinematic spectatorship, one that 5 years before Einstein's premiere, Stanley Cavell argued was essential to the meaning of the form. When movie-going was casual, Cavell noted, and we entered at no matter what point in the proceedings, during the news or a short subject or somewhere in the future, enjoying the recognition later of the return of the exact moment at which one entered, and from then on feeling free to decide when to leave or whether to see the familiar part through again, we took our fantasies and companions and anonymity inside and left with them intact. For Cavell, this essentially private encounter with the filmic apparatus was fundamentally different from the collective experience of attending plays or operas. And it's the idea of a projector looping constantly, whether or not there is an attentive audience, that led Fried to praise what he called the automatic guaranteed anti-theatricality of cinema. Fourth, and in light of this, other key aspects of Wilson's stagecraft might also be described as cinematic, at least in the terms through which modernists celebrated cinema as a de-anthropomorphic alternative to live theater. The film actor's body loses its corporeality, it evaporates, it is deprived of reality, life, voice, and the noises caused by moving about, to quote Benjamin, quoting Pirandello. And this, it seems to me, is what Wilson's famous and famously meticulous lighting effects struggle to achieve. Not one production goes by without Wilson dismembering the body in some way with light, notes one critic. Another describes actors detached from the surrounding environment, seeming to float in space. Wilson himself calls some of his effects close-ups, and as I've already noted, he praises proscenium theater for the tension it sets up between 2 and 3 dimensions. Finally, and on a more local level, Einstein is full of what Fried has taught us to identify as classically absorptive actions, people reading books and newspapers, writing, typing, conversing privately, listening to inaudible sounds, practicing the violin. These actions separate the characters, or whatever they are, from the audience. And when actors do turn and face the hall directly, it's never with an empathic gesture, but rather a blank stare or a horrible grimace. Rather than breaking through the fourth wall, they seem trapped within it. And it's worth mentioning here that the sheer intensity of Wilson's lighting effects often blinds the eyes of those on stage. Absorption isn't just thematized, in other words, it's also violently imposed. With all this in mind, I'd like to play an excerpt from one of Einstein's many trial scenes now. And I should say that I find these scenes especially interesting. If the courtroom, as it's represented here, is a kind of theatrical space, right, a mise en abîme that goes back to Shakespeare and to the Lamesttia, then it seems worth thinking about the status of a trial where no evidence is presented and no judgment is made. So just a few minutes from one of these scenes. Yeah.
You see any of those baggy pants? It was huge, Mr. Bojangles. If you see any of those baggy pants, it was huge. Chuck the hills. If you know it was a violin to be, answer the telephone. And if anyone asks you, please, it was trees. It is you see any of those baggy pants, check the hills. It was huge. If you know it was a violin to be, answer the telephone. And if anyone asks you, please, it was trees. It is like that. Mr. Bojangles, Mr. Bojangles, Mr. Bojangles, I reach you. The scarf of women in black and white. This is about the things on the table. This one could be counting up. This one has been being very American. The scarf of women in black and white. Mr. Bojangles, if you see any of those baggy pants, it was huge. Chop the hills. If you know it was a violin to be, answer the telephone. And if anyone asks you, please, it was trees. It is like that. So, this could be reflections for Christopher Nolan, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison. So this could be like
Who is on trial? One recent scholar asks about this scene. Is it Patty Hearst? Einstein for opening the door to the atomic bomb? No one in particular. Stefan Brecht indicates that Einstein was a dreamer and thus the bad can be associated with him. But to his mind, the bad, not Einstein, is on trial, and his guess is as surreal as any other. For Brecht, the bad was, quote, a remnant of some fleeting plot idea that Wilson had, presumably at some stage in the work's development. This passage is typical of writing on Robert Wilson, and I can confirm that whether or not you find Einstein boring, there is something uniquely tedious about reading much scholarship on the word. Accounts tend to alternate between breathless description and self-defeating stabs at interpretation. There's little written evidence, in other words, that Einstein's spectators have been emancipated and granted some radical freedom to create their own meanings in an open-ended dialogue with the work itself. Instead, it seems to produce a sort of scholarly aphasia, which reiterates the acts of stuttering and hysterical stenography depicted on the stage. Okay, this mimetic effect, in which the overwhelmingly boring, incoherent, and idiotic qualities of an artwork transfer themselves to the language of its audience, is a hallmark of the affective structure CNI terms stupidity. A specifically late modern combination of the astonishing and tedious, the stuplime, like its 18th century antecedent, challenges, quote, our own capacity to interpret or respond in conventional ways. The difference, though, is that it does so by drawing us down, I'm quoting Nye still, by drawing us down into the sensual and material domain of language and its dulling and irritating iterability, rather than elevating us up to a transcendent, supersensual, or spiritual plane. I'd note that Nye's main examples of the literary sublime, Stein and Beckett, are precisely those writers who Glass cites as influences, and that many other aspects of Einstein follow her playbook closely. Its low slapstick humor, its foregrounding of racialized bodies and voices, its fascination with the speech of the mentally disabled. My sense, then, is that while Einstein is resolutely opposed to the experience of intersubjective openness with which it is often credited, it also deliberately falls short of staging the sort of magical encounter with radical autonomy valorized by a critic like Freed. For Nye, stuplimity gives shape to the experience of going limp or falling down in the face of larger systems, and you might say that Einstein's failure to achieve or fully believe in its own poetics of negation is its biggest, most subversive joke. Indeed, what seems provocative about Einstein is its combination of two distinct but adjacent modes of aesthetic disengagement, good and bad, Freudian and Niesque, properly modernist and comically sublime. In the remainder of this talk, I'd like to suggest that for about 10 years, the subsequent development of American minimalist opera was fueled by an attempt to repress, resolve, and redirect this very tension. So here then are 4 snapshots from a history of American opera as it emerged in the shadow of Einstein on the beach. 1980. 2 years after Einstein premiered and went on tour, Philip Glass received a commission from the city of Rotterdam to write a, quote, real opera that capitalized on its peri-institutional success. Satyagraha, the resulting work, would prove more influential than Einstein ever was. It now seems to be the founding work of what David Goodkin calls neo-grand opera, a genre whose basic format is very much still with us. It's easy to identify the features that make Satyagraha a real opera, a proper orchestra, classically trained singers, characters with names who move through something that might be described as a plot. What's significant, though, is that despite the terms of the original commission, critics have long insisted that Satyagraha is not an opera at all. Tim Page's New Grove essay claims that it is, quote, vastly different from traditional music drama, designed on a moral, indeed religious plane, and as such is closer to ritual than entertainment, to mystery play than standard opera. For Daniel Mendelssohn, what Satyagraha aims at in both its text and its music is a kind of meditative state of spiritual elevation that allows us to think clearly about Gandhi's goodness and its effects, rather than to get wrapped up in his drama. These are textbook anti-theatrical valorizations, of course, but there's also an unacknowledged tension here. It seems strange to use ritual, the very paradigm of spectatorial immersion, as a strategy for keeping the audience at bay. Indeed, and unlike earlier 20th century attempts at ritual opera, Noah's Flood, Der Ja-Sager, what Satyagraha seems truly to aim at is a peculiar form of proscenium ritual. One strategy, I'd claim, for keeping its drama pure, and as such, evading the threat of the sublime. The fact that the libretto is written in Sanskrit is another aspect of this refusal. It's not just that no actually existing audience can understand what's being sung, it's also that, to return to Nye, the linguistic estrangement, so different from Einstein's schoolbook rhymes and pop cultural references, prevents us from being drawn down into the sensual and material domain of language. Satyagraha is just as boringly incomprehensible as Einstein, that's to say, but it doesn't irritate the same capacity to interpret or respond. As is the case with any hieratic language, we don't need to know precisely what it's saying to somehow know that it's saying something good. In 1984, Akhenaten, the final work in what has now become Glass's Great Man trilogy, is even more of a real opera than Satyagraha. Its grandiose ancient Egyptian setting can only bring to mind Aida, and many of its scenes seem modeled on the specific conventions of grand opera. There's a love duet, a ballet, a reflective aria sung by a monarch alone in his study, a domestic scene where women sing for each other, a spectacular crowd scene involving the destruction of the temple. My sense, though, is that the closer Glass gets to Meyerbeer and Verdi, the more the strangeness of his style, its stasis, its inexpressivity, comes into focus. One of his collaborators described Akhenaten as singing archaeology, and I can't think of another opera that insists so obsessively that its historical characters are now dead. We see them as ghosts at the end of the work, and there's a remarkable scene where a contemporary guide re-narrates the plot of the opera to bored tourists. A decade before Culture and Imperialism, Glass seems to have had a similar intuition about Aida's own lifelessness, and he used it as another strategy to prevent his audience from getting involved too closely in the onstage drama. 1987. John Adams' first opera, Nixon in China, is full of references to Glass's portrait operas, and its famous reliance on televisual imagery might be understood alongside Einstein's cinematic aspirations. What makes Nixon different from any of Glass's operas, though, at least in this context, is an increasing and extensively thematized self-consciousness about spectatorship itself. Pat Nixon spends most of the opera reacting inappropriately to Chinese propaganda, attempting to relate personally and emotionally to mass-produced sublime spectacles whose preordained meanings refute interpretation. Right? So Pat, this little elephant in glass, brings back so many memories. Tell me, is it one of a kind? Chorus, it has been carefully designed by workers at this factory. They can make hundreds every day. Chorus, this is the People's Clinic. Pat, ouch, I think it's sort of rude to watch. Chorus, do not distress yourself, she begs. She will get well, come see the pigs. It's easy to interpret these passages as parodies of American earnestness, but given Nixon's thoroughgoing conflation of Chinese propaganda, American mass media, and grand operatic pageantry, it might be better to say that Pat seems uncomfortable in the aesthetic world of the opera as a whole. Indeed, to the extent that she's the work's heroine, it's through her longing for a form of engagement that seems like an alternative both to conventional theatrical spectatorship and to its modernist negations. Her climactic aria might, in this context, be read as a plea for acknowledgement directly opposed to the central terms of art and objecthood. Let the expression on the face of the Statue of Liberty change just a little, she sings. Let her see what lies inland. It's a prayer for an everyday sort of intrication of the roles of artist and spectator, and suggests that Pat Nixon may be closer to the world of Julia Kristeva than Robert Wilson ever was. 1990. Not unlike Satyagraha, Adams' second opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, makes a sudden turn to ritual. Here, however, his claim to filter contemporary politics through the lens of the Bach Passion seems to have backfired. And I think it's largely the opera's ambivalent anti-theatrical poetics that has created such problems for the work. After all, Richard Taruskin's notorious attack on Klinghoffer is based on a perceived juxtaposition between, quote, the portrayal of suffering Palestinians in the musical language of myth and ritual, and a musically trivial portrait of contented materialistic American Jews straight from a sitcom. Taruskin, in other words, seems primarily concerned not about an abstract moral opposition, but rather a confusing oscillation between the two competing modes I've been trying to describe. One good, based on the elevated circularity of sacred drama, and one bad, based on the sublime seriality of slapstick and television. And while I think it's fair to say that most people now agree with Robert Fink's counterproposal, that Klinghoffer rejects what he calls terror's glamour, valorizing a form of everyday and distinctly Pat Nixonian engagement embodied in its Jewish characters, we might still do more to think about the strangeness of articulating that message in an opera. Fink speaks of the life-affirming virtues of small things, but that affirmation is also a rejection of the aesthetics of neo-grand opera itself. Thank you.
I think I'll just open things up. Questions?
Thanks, I was struck when I love the part where you say it doesn't really matter if your presence is not required, right? This is going to go on for hours and hours without you. And that you can come and go and nothing changes. This makes me think about my colleague Lutz Krupnik has recently written a book about Michael Bay's films. Mm-hmm. And he says you can have a 12-minute extended fight sequence that makes no sense whatsoever, because nobody is watching the film like that. They watch it on their phones, they come and go. The point of attention is not the same kind of attention. And I think it's really interesting that you can have something that is this frenetic, kinetic, nonstop that makes no sense, and what you're describing can have the same effect on the way an audience can engage with the piece. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that circularity.
No, I mean, I think that sounds fantastic, and I think it's if he's thinking about cinema, I think that's the model for this sort of thing, and yeah, I mean, it's the tension between like hyper virtuosity and lack of engagement, which seems, I think, is part of what's interesting, but like it's the fact that people are on stage performing things that are phenomenally difficult and they're not performing them for you. Seems what's interesting, right? So that like that's just not what the function of virtuosity normally is in a performance. But I mean, is the book published yet?
It is, yeah. It came out this spring at, what is it called? It's in this series on contemporary filmmakers. All the rest of them, I think, are auteurs.
Right.
And he's like, yeah, maybe, but Michael Bay makes more money than God. And he's clearly figured out something about the way people attend to cinema. And so I think there might be counterintuitively a connection.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.
So, I'm wondering how you define American minimalist opera. Because, and to what degree does that definition then encompass a certain body of works that that can be read in this particular timeline?
Yeah, I mean, I'm defining it obviously very, very narrowly. It does seem to me that, and also very conventionally, right? Like this is the most conventional. But I mean, I do think that this specific body of works like does actually seem to be arguing with Einstein and with sort of each previous work. In terms of, and it does seem to me also that something is actually sort of over with Blenhofer. Like I'd be uncomfortable, with either lighter glass operas or more recent animist pieces. I mean, I feel like I'm not entirely sure that this is still the relevant world. But I mean, I'd be curious.
I don't know.
For ideas about like other things that should be incorporated into this, and how sort of narrow this is. No, but I mean it's an important thing to think about. Yeah.
Just a footnote about Satyagara. I think it depends a lot how this piece is directed, if we can call it neo-grand opera or not. A couple of months ago I saw in The Hague production that minimized the ensemble. The only grand thing that was left was a choir, and then there were a few pianos and few instruments, and it was with Indian dance. No trace of any grand aesthetics there, so it's curious also that the viewpoint of the director can change the piece a lot.
Yeah, is that the Berkowski production? No, okay.
I forgot now what was the name.
No, I mean, it's a good point, and I mean, the other thing, there's another sort of version of this paper that's more about operatic staging, but I think part of what's interesting about Satyagraha is the fact that it can be staged in radically different ways, and people think that is with, Einstein, Nixon in China, is that production in some way that seems interesting to me. So although I agree with you, you could do a non-grand operatic production of Satyagraha, and that seems like a thing that would be worth doing. It seems to me that the fact that you think it can have different productions in the first place is also a sign that it's being treated like a grand opera, and that like we believe that a Verdi opera or a Wagner opera is good enough that it merits different types of productions and that the music is more important than other things. So the fact that you can perform it in a different way actually seems in a way part of what makes it operatic. Yeah,
I think also Einstein was so quickly canonized by the 84 BAM revival, which was the goal of it, and so can anyone name any other Glass director? No, that is the one thing, and then Glass becomes an opera composer, and all of his other collaborators are, well-known people, but not anyone that we know. I don't know who directed the original Satyagraha production, and that has, when it goes to the Met, it's not about presenting the original production.
The original
has, this canonized group of collaborators.
Yeah, I mean, the original subject matter director is famous, and but it's just like it doesn't matter anymore. Like it just becomes sort of irrelevant to the sort of, you know what I mean? Like it's a different way of being canonical.
And
Absolutely.
The important point is the Wilson is author of Einstein.
Yeah.
The directors are not authors of the other pieces. So that's a huge difference there.
Yeah, no, and I think that part of the entering into the sort of like Glass becoming a opera composer as opposed to something else is that like he's the author, right, and not the director. Absolutely.
I was really struck by your observation on the cinematic quality of Wilson. That in a sense this really is the precedent for the kind of distance, for the kind of anti-theatricality that you're proposing, and all of a sudden it elucidated a lot about Wilson's works to me, which is that it's directly cinematic. I mean, like, it's constantly sort of troping early silent cinema. Even in early so-called silent operas, I mean, they're not exactly silent, but they're kind of references to silent cinema, and the kind of hyper-pale, face painting stuff that he uses, the very bright lighting. It imitates, like, the way these films, these kind of degrade in modern projector, at least the way they look when they're projected. And I'm remembering I saw Wilson actually performed and directed this production of Epic Scrap's Last Tape, and the entire conceit seemed basically a kind of like expressionist horror movie, and the entire thing was somehow happening as if he was but anyway, that's just to say that was a very useful insight on your part, Györgi. But I'm wondering what that has to do with the relationship between sort of self-awareness or self-reflexivity in the work of Wilson versus what you were saying in Nixon, for example. Is there a kind of self-reflexivity in Wilson's works about their distance, like built into the, like I'm saying, like troping the cinema is actually doing that. I'm wondering how you see that.
I mean, this sort of strangeness of trying to make live theater into cinema, and then the sort of elaborate, the sort of variety of strategies that are engaged to do that. Like, there's obviously self-aware and strange. I mean, I guess my quick answer would be that it doesn't seem in a sort of textbook Wilson production like that there's a position outside of it you can occupy, which I do think, like in Nixon, there is. Like it seems to me like that, like you're, like you can't be sort of outside of. Well, I mean, maybe that's. Yeah. I mean, although I mean, thinking about your talk, it's partially the. I mean, what would then seem interesting is to be both cinematic and sort of radically participatory, or like we're communally creating.
Yeah. I'm sure there's an aesthetic of autism in Wilson, I think.
Yeah.
It's hard to think, like, where would you get outside for it? Like, or what's a self-reflexive notion without an outside to look towards? So.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Can I, just to add to that, Matthew, and sorry, just because you were talking about the kind of failures of autonomy, kind of Einstein's dwelling on the failures of autonomy, finally, and that's kind of what turns it into this decline in some ways, and that does seem to kind of overlap with, or in some ways be in tension with what David was talking about, with this kind of the relationship between the idea of art kind of interpenetrating daily life and the idea of the totality of the book, and I think you two were talking about the kind of the kind of failures of autonomy of the book and kind of related ways. Sorry, Matthew.
Okay, thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. I just wanted to ask if the legacy of Einstein and the idea of sublimity, which I had forgotten how much I appreciate as a concept, the legacy of Einstein's sublimity on Adam's language in general, and you consider that his operas are often considered CNN operas, making a link between a sort of 24-hour news cycle and that kind of sublimity, and also something that you can just tune into, and it just is sort of going, you can tune out of at any moment. And there seems to be some link between that and Adam's, a negative take on Adam's musical language as being just a sort of endless succession of triads and repetitions of text, and not just in the kind of sublime music that you singled out, I guess, the portrayal of the sort of the Jewish slapstick. I think that scene was ended up being cut from. Yeah, but that as being particularly sublime. I'm wondering if Adam's language in general and the sort of world of the CNN opera is also one that really taps into that Einsteinian legacy of just sort of ongoing, sublime, mind-numbing repetition.
Yeah, although it's also it's much more musical in sort of all sorts of ways than Einstein. Like the arias have forms, and so I would be, I in a way real high minimalism sort of before any of this seems like the most obvious sort of musical that seems to fit sort of perfectly into this way of thinking about things. There's something about this the specific sort of John Adams harmonic stasis that seems slightly different from this, but I think in general thinking about minimalism in these terms is really productive. I would want to think more about Adams' sort of style specifically, which often seems like it's sort of fighting against that. But I think that's the sort of question. And yeah.
Yeah, you can also certainly find sublimity in by the time you get to the 30th da capo aria and something like that.
Yeah.
Than even in traditional.
Connecting to Matthew's question, in a way, thinking about Dr. Atomic, where they wanted to have a libretto and he ended up with a good one, but the idea of language that repels or is some kind of military transference are not anybody's idea of libretto versus something that really draws you in. So the audience is the thing we remember is Bad Hurry Hard, which is John Donne, but it's also his great moment, Oppenheimer's great moment of angst and whatever. So he may be angsty throughout, but the difference with the language is something that we can't ever really get into it until that moment. And so it seemed like almost what you were saying, a combination of Einstein and Cacciari, where it's something that's literally incomprehensible, because listening to Eric Owen singing military transcripts is just not going to make him a character. And you can't see him as absorbed in anything, but then there's nothing, everything else repels the audience in a way.
Yeah.
It's triviality.
No, I think that's something right. And still the criticism, I feel like the most standard journalistic critique of both that and Quilts of the Golden West, that where we see what is just that you can't make an opera based on documents, that's bad, and it's boring. So I feel like that does actually still seem to sort of genuinely irritate audiences. Look in a way that's interesting, right? And it's clearly what they're working with. But it's interesting that seems to be what actually most upsets people about those operas at this point.
And if it weren't just opposed to that,
Right, you
Matter
would
by heart, you would notice.
Yeah.
One of the things about minimalism that I think is
We don't hear.
Can you come in here?
We can't hear.
We cannot hear you.
We can't
Repetition, okay.
Do I need to speak up?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay,
We're hiding behind a curtain here.
one of the things about minimalism that's always struck me is that the repetition is almost mathematical. It is mathematical, in fact, I think. And if it's mathematical, then it's fractal. And fractals, of course, Mandelbrot's work with fractal geometry, and they're self-similar, they're self-organizing. They're also infinitely recursive, right? They just repeat infinitely. And, so in that sense, the repetition of minimalism plugs into some kind of eternal, it's like a recurrence of the eternal, which I think was something that started in the Renaissance with Galileo's discovery of chronology and time, and standardizing that with the rotation of the Earth and so on. So I think that the narrative sort of was born in, and that's sort of Paul Rousseau's argument in Time and Narrative, the first one of that, or the art basically as the narrative begins with chronology and the breakdown of the eternal. But what we see with minimalism and Einstein class in particular is a recurrence in practice.
I have a thought about that if I can.
Please.
Sorry, but I mean, it's certainly true that there are strict minimalist pieces that follow these extremely highly organized recursive patterns. Something that was very illuminating for me recently, I read just a short, I think like an online piece by Kyle Gann, maybe it's being published somewhere, maybe in your book, I don't even know, but it's a musical analysis of Einstein on the Beach that shows that against what you actually perceive or basically began as saying, I always thought that Einstein on the Beach was this kind of heavily structured, hyper kind of fractal organizational plan. And in fact, when I finally got my hands on a score, I see that it's much looser than I expected. And that seems interesting, that Glass actually started to depart from the fairly patterned work that he had been doing. You have the impression of those patterns still. You think that it must be following some sort of hyper-eternal logic, but it's actually much looser and more whimsical even than the listeners thought for decades.
Speaking of the hyper-eternal, we should probably take a break. And I think there's coffee in the kitchen, right?
Yes, there's coffee in the kitchen. There's bathrooms upstairs and also lower down.
So we have about 15 minutes, but thank you very much both.
Yes, it's so fantastic. I was in Chicago in 2002. That's the last time I was there. Yes, exactly. Don, was still there. Reception for
We're not. It's always.
Yeah. How about you? Nuts, but okay.
Yeah, you are both keeping your hands right now, so.
How's life for you?
It's okay. I was thinking about obsessed with your book, so parsing it, like glossing it like it's a page. But I was thinking about you a lot recently because he is so down that rabbit hole right now. It's really exciting. It's a lot of fun to see somebody else get excited about it like what I read. So it's fun. It's good. It's really the bad
So you made it, David.
I made it.
You made it. Great.
Oh no, I took all of your advice. I wish you'd say
I'm David. Thanks so much. No, it's okay. I was disappointed, but I understand. I'm glad you made time for your own.
Yeah, I mean, they did say that there was a 6 a.m. clock that they said they could potentially get it, but I thought they said by, and I was like, no, I was thinking.
Yeah, so that's fine. And in fact, I think we just recorded it. I can make you watch the video recording. No, thanks so much for coming.
What someone wedded, and we started to whenever they say 15 minutes, I think that's code for 2 hours. So they give you a code. Yeah. If it's just be 15 minutes, they'll say, we'll let you know. Exactly. And then we went back to the gate, and then mechanics came and they said, so please stand by, and they just canceled the code. So whenever it was last night, I had no or whatever, Thursday night, so like they said, okay, you can go to one. Oh, sure.
Good to see you. Yeah.
I'm here.
We got here.
Oh, great. Nice. So it's like you're still oh my god. How civilized. Cool, I'm gonna get it back. Yeah. Oh, great. Hi, it's great to meet you. I've heard so much about you, read so much of you, so yeah, exactly. How great.
And right over the book, as the book of our talks, I was thinking that it's based on this, the narrative of crazy interpolations and reorganisms and so on. Yeah. Also, I guess You can ask Scott tomorrow.
Yeah, and first would be
It's really fascinating. It's so gratifying. You felt like everything was the tip of another iceberg that you've ever read. You can so that this is the book. How is this?
This is basically one chapter. It's the last chapter. It's the culmination of the book as I'm seeing it. So the whole book is tracing Meredith's operatic engagements with ideas about history and ideas of operatic form. Yeah. Oh no! I mean, somehow the book is it covers years from the late 60s up till the early 90s.
No, I thought you must have but what I wanted to ask you was the extension of of course, this really the idea to broadcast everything. To what extent might that have been connected to the whole now saying? Because I remember specifically in the 70s, whenever someone would say something about you believe that the saying is the broadcast on loudspeaker, someone would come back and go, what do you think of your advertising? We're also living in the loudspeaker culture just because it's not, the chairman doesn't even know the subject. And so the idea that the artists would kind of, in the 70s, artists would also themselves and they were expensive. Just the idea that their screens would
That's an HDMI.
Politically naive and apolitical. So unlike so many of the
Are we all, do we sit? I guess we all sit up.
you don't know. You don't know. It's not just like use nothing.
Fine with having you.
I haven't thought about it. It's interesting.
It is. So sometimes I read there's a novel of the 70s called Daniel Martin by Jonathan.
Yeah, maybe we should take the audio.
He's a novel.
Yes, let's do that.